Cavendish Avenue, London. September 20th, 1969. The phone call comes at midday. Paul McCartney is in his music room, working on a piano melody that will eventually become Maybe I'm Amazed. The phone rings. It's Ringo. "There's a meeting at Apple," Ringo says. "John wants everyone there." Paul asks what it's about. Ringo hesitates. "I think you should just come." Paul drives to Savile Row, parks on the street and walks up the stairs to the second-floor office. John Lennon is sitting in a chair, Yoko Ono beside him. George Harrison is by the window. Ringo is near the door. Alan Klein, the manager Paul never wanted, is standing near the desk. John doesn't wait for formalities. "I've decided to leave the Beatles," he says. "I want a divorce." The words hang in the air. Paul's face goes white. "What do you mean?" he asks, though the answer is obvious. "John, I'm done. I've been thinking about it for months. It's over." Paul starts to argue, but John cuts him off. "It's not a discussion, Paul. I'm telling you, I'm out." This was the moment Paul McCartney realized the band was already dead, though the public death would not be announced for another 7 months. "I went into that meeting thinking we were going to talk about the next album," Paul would recall decades later. "I came out realizing there was no next album. There was no band. John had killed it with one sentence." The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Paul had spent his entire adult life being a Beatle. It was not just his job, it was his identity, his purpose, his family. "I didn't know who I was without the Beatles," he admitted in a 1984 interview with Paul Gambaccini. "I'd been part of this thing since I was 15 years old. Suddenly, John was saying it was over, and I was supposed to just accept it and move on. I couldn't." The meeting continued for another hour, but Paul barely heard any of it. Alan Klein explained that John's decision needed to remain private. They were in the middle of renegotiating their contract with EMI. If the label knew the Beatles were breaking up, their leverage would evaporate. John agreed to keep quiet. "Klein said we'd lose millions if we announced it now," Paul recounted in Barry Miles's biography. "So John agreed to this absurd plan where we'd all pretend the band still existed. We'd finish our obligations, smile for the cameras, and privately, we'd all know it was a lie." George's reaction was telling. "George looked relieved," Paul said. "He didn't argue with John. He didn't try to change his mind. He just nodded, like John had finally said what we'd all been thinking. Ringo looked sad, but he didn't fight it either. I was the only one who seemed upset, which made me feel pathetic." Paul left the Apple office in a daze. He drove home to Cavendish Avenue, where Linda was waiting. She would later describe him as destroyed. He walked in the door and just stood there, Linda said in a 1989 interview. He didn't speak. He went straight to the music room and locked the door. I could hear him playing piano, just fragments of melodies, nothing complete. He stayed in there for hours. That evening, Paul emerged and told Linda what had happened. "I don't know what to do," he said. "The band is over, and I'm not allowed to tell anyone." Linda suggested they leave London, go somewhere remote where he could think. Within days, they began planning a trip to High Park Farm in Kintyre, Scotland, the property they had purchased earlier that year as a retreat. "Scotland became our escape," Paul said. "It was the only place where I could breathe." The following weeks were marked by a surreal performance of normalcy. Abbey Road had been completed in August and was released on September 26th, less than a week after John's announcement. The album was a massive commercial and critical success. The public believed the Beatles were at their peak. Behind the scenes, the 4 members could barely speak to each other. "We did photo shoots for the album where we had to stand together and smile," Paul recalled. "I'd look at John and think, 'You just quit. This is all fake.' But we couldn't tell anyone. So we smiled and waved and pretended everything was fine." The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Paul's depression, which had been manageable during the White Album and Get Back sessions, deepened into something clinical. "I stopped sleeping," he said. "I'd lie awake replaying the meeting, replaying John's words. I wanted divorce, like we were a marriage that had failed." In October 1969, Paul and Linda retreated to Scotland. High Park Farm was a modest property with a small stone farmhouse, surrounded by fields and sheep. There was no phone, no television, no connection to the music industry. "We were hiding," Linda said, "from the press, from the other Beatles, from the reality of what was happening." Paul spent his days doing manual labor, fixing fences, feeding animals, riding a tractor. "The physical work was therapeutic," he said. "I'd wake up at dawn, put on work clothes, and just lose myself in simple tasks. For a few hours, I could forget I was Paul McCartney from the Beatles. I was just a guy fixing a fence." But the depression followed him. "I started drinking too much," he admitted. "Whiskey mostly. Linda would find me in the barn at midnight, drunk, crying. She'd get me inside and put me to bed. The next day, I'd do it again." The psychological weight was compounded by public perception. In late October, a rumor began circulating that Paul was dead, that he had died in a car crash in 1966 and been replaced by a look-alike. The Paul is dead conspiracy was fueled by supposed clues in Beatles lyrics and album covers. Paul found the rumor absurd, but also metaphorically accurate. "I wasn't dead, but I felt dead," he said. "The Paul McCartney who had been a Beatle was gone. Whatever I was now, it wasn't that." The press camped outside Cavendish Avenue in London and eventually tracked him to Scotland. On October 21st, a photographer and reporter from Life magazine arrived at High Park Farm unannounced. Paul, unshaven and disheveled, confronted them angrily. He threw a bucket of water at the photographer. Linda recalled, "He was furious that they'd invaded our privacy, but he also looked like a man who'd lost everything." The resulting photos, published in Life, showed a Paul McCartney the world had never seen, wild-haired, rough, defeated. In November, Paul began recording music alone. He set up a makeshift studio in the farmhouse using a 4-track tape machine. "I didn't know what else to do," he said in a 1971 interview. "The band was over. I couldn't play with John and George and Ringo, but I still had music in me. So I started recording it myself." The songs that emerged were raw and unpolished. The lovely Linda, that would be something. Junk, Teddy Boy. He played all the instruments himself. Guitar, bass, drums, keyboards. "It was liberating and terrifying," he said. "Liberating because I didn't have to negotiate with anyone. I could play whatever I wanted. Terrifying because there was no one to tell me if it was good or not. I had no safety net." The decision to make a solo album was both a creative necessity and a political statement. If the Beatles were dead, then Paul needed to prove he could exist without them. "I think I was trying to show John that I didn't need him," Paul reflected in 2001. "Which was childish, but that's where I was emotionally. I wanted to make something that was entirely mine." The album, eventually titled McCartney, was intentionally lo-fi and homemade. "I didn't want it to sound professional," he said. "I wanted it to sound like a man in a room, making music because he had to." The sonic aesthetic was the opposite of the elaborate productions of Sgt. Pepper or Abbey Road. It was intimate, vulnerable, almost embarrassingly personal. "I knew people would criticize it," Paul said. "I knew they'd say it wasn't as good as Beatles albums, but I didn't care. It was mine." By December 1969, Paul's depression had reached its nadir. Linda later described finding him in bed in the middle of the afternoon, unwilling or unable to get up. "He'd just lie there, staring at the ceiling," she said. "He'd say things like, 'What's the point? It's all over.' I was genuinely worried about him." His drinking escalated. "I'd start at breakfast," Paul admitted. "Just a little whiskey in my tea. By evening, I'd be properly drunk. Linda tried to stop me, but I didn't want to stop. Being drunk was easier than being sober and facing the reality. On New Year's Eve, 1969, Paul and Linda sat in the farmhouse as the decade ended. "We didn't celebrate," Linda said. "We just sat by the fire, not talking. The 60s were over. The Beatles were over. We didn't know what came next." In January 1970, Alan Klein informed Paul that the Let It Be album, compiled from the disastrous January 1969 Get Back sessions, was nearly complete. Phil Spector had been hired to produce and mix the tapes. Paul was not consulted. "Klein just made the decision," Paul said bitterly. "He hired Spector without asking me, and John and George and Ringo supported it because they wanted someone to fix the mess we'd made." When Paul heard Spector's version of The Long and Winding Road, his own ballad, he was horrified. Spector had added strings, harps, and a choir. "It was everything I didn't want," Paul said. "I'd written this simple, intimate song about my emotional state, and Spector turned it into a Las Vegas production number." He sent a telegram to Klein. "Don't ever do it again." The response was silence. The humiliation of losing creative control over his own work was the final confirmation that the band was not just dead. It was actively working against him. "I realized I had no power," Paul said. "I was outvoted 3-1 on every decision. Klein controlled the money. John, George, and Ringo supported Klein. I was trapped in a partnership that no longer functioned, and I had no way out except the courts." The Eastmans, Linda's father and brother, advised Paul that his only legal option was to dissolve the partnership entirely. That meant suing Apple Corps. That meant suing John, George, and Ringo. "I didn't want to do it," Paul said in his 1997 authorized biography. "The idea of suing my best friends, the guys I'd been through everything with, made me sick. But I couldn't see any other option. If I didn't act, Klein would control my music forever." In March 1970, Paul informed EMI and Apple that he was releasing his solo album, McCartney, in April. Alan Klein ordered him to delay the release to avoid conflicting with Let It Be, which was scheduled for May. Paul refused. "I'd had enough," he said. "It was my album. I'd made it myself. I was releasing it when I wanted." Klein sent Ringo to Cavendish Avenue on March 31st to personally deliver a letter demanding Paul postpone the album. The meeting was brief and brutal. "Ringo came to my house with this letter from Klein," Paul recalled. "I read it and just said no. Ringo tried to explain that it was for the good of the band, that Let It Be needed space. I told him there was no band. John had quit 6 months ago. We were just pretending. Ringo looked confused, like he didn't know what to say. So I told him to leave. I physically removed him from my house. I felt terrible immediately, but I was so angry." The press release for the McCartney album, distributed on April 10, 1970, included a self-interview that Paul had written as a way to explain his actions. The questions and answers were designed to be ambiguous, but were interpreted by the press as an announcement of the breakup. "Are you planning a new album or single with the Beatles?" Paul's answer, "No." "Is your break with the Beatles temporary or permanent, due to personal differences or musical ones?" Answer, "Personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but most of all because I have a better time with my family. Temporary or permanent? I don't really know." "Do you foresee a time when Lennon-McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again?" Answer, "No." The Daily Mirror headlined the next day, "Paul quits the Beatles." The reaction was immediate and vicious. Fans blamed Paul for breaking up the band. John was furious that Paul had stolen his narrative. "I started the band. I disbanded it," John told Jan Wenner in his December 1970 Rolling Stone interview. "It's my band. I decided it was dead. but Paul had to be the one to announce it. He couldn't let me have that. George was similarly angry. "Paul hasn't really thought about us," George told Melody Maker. "He's just concerned about himself. He's not thinking about the implications of what he's doing." Even Ringo felt betrayed. "We were supposed to keep it quiet until the business was sorted," Ringo said. Paul broke the pact. Paul's response was resigned. "I was the villain," he said. "I was the guy who broke up the Beatles even though John had quit 6 months earlier, but I couldn't explain that without betraying John's confidence. So I just took the blame. The psychological toll of being the public face of the breakup was immense. Paul received death threats. Fans protested outside Cavendish Avenue. Critics savaged the McCartney album. Rolling Stone's review, written by Langdon Winner, called it harum-scarum and a cheap, drab production. Greil Marcus later described it as monumentally irrelevant. Paul read every review, absorbed every insult. "I thought the album was honest," he said, "but everyone else thought it was self-indulgent garbage. I started to doubt everything. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was nothing without John." Linda tried to shield him from the worst of the press, but it was impossible. "The negativity was everywhere," she said. "Paul would read a vicious review and just shut down. He'd stop eating, stop talking. I'd find him sitting in the dark, just staring." In May 1970, the Let It Be album and film were released. The film, which documented the January 1969 sessions, showed the Beatles at their lowest, bickering, disconnected, miserable. The album featured Phil Spector's orchestral productions, which Paul publicly disavowed. "I had no say in how it was released," Paul told the press. "That's not my album. That's Klein's album." The public watched Let It Be and saw a band in collapse. The illusion was shattered. The Beatles were not just broken up. They had been broken up for over a year, and everyone had lied about it. Paul's anger at the deception was profound. "We lied to the fans," he said. "We told them everything was fine when it wasn't. We smiled in interviews and released albums and pretended we were still a band. It was dishonest and disrespectful." Through the summer of 1970, Paul's isolation deepened. He stopped answering phone calls from the other Beatles. He avoided London. He stayed in Scotland, working on his farm, recording fragments of songs. "I didn't want to be Paul McCartney anymore," he said. "I wanted to be a farmer. I wanted to be anonymous. I wanted to disappear." Linda became his only emotional anchor. "Without Linda, I wouldn't have survived," Paul said in multiple interviews. "She kept me alive. She made me get out of bed. She made me eat. She reminded me that I had a life outside of the Beatles." In August, Linda gave birth to their daughter Mary, named after Paul's late mother. The birth provided a momentary sense of purpose. "Holding Mary, I thought maybe there was a future," Paul said. "Maybe I could be something other than a failed Beatle." But the legal and financial realities remained. Alan Klein controlled Apple Corps and, by extension, the Beatles' catalogue and earnings. Paul's royalties from Beatles sales went into the partnership account, which Klein administered. "I was making music that was earning millions, and I couldn't access my own money," Paul said. "I had to ask Klein for permission to use funds from my own work. It was humiliating." The Eastmans pressed Paul to file a lawsuit. "They told me it was the only way to break Klein's control," Paul said, "but filing meant suing John, George, and Ringo. It meant making the breakup legal and permanent. It meant becoming the villain all over again." Through the fall of 1970, Paul agonized over the decision. "I didn't sleep," he told Barry Miles. "I'd lie awake thinking, if I do this, I'm the one who legally ends the Beatles. But if I don't do this, Klein controls everything forever." On December 31st, 1970, the last day of the decade that defined them, Paul's lawyers filed a writ in the Chancery Division of the High Court of London. The case was titled McCartney versus Lennon, Harrison, Starkey, and apple core. Paul was not in London when the papers were filed. He was in Scotland, alone with Linda and their children, drinking whiskey by the fire. "I knew once the papers were filed, there was no going back," he said. "The Beatles would be legally dead. And I'd be the one who killed them. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. I felt like I'd destroyed something beautiful," he said. "Even though it was already dead, even though John had killed it first, I was the one making it official. I was the one with blood on my hands." The public reaction to the lawsuit filed in January 1971 was predictably hostile. Paul was vilified in the press. John, George, and Ringo filed counter-affidavits attacking his character and motives. John's affidavit called Paul's complaints the tantrums of a spoiled child. George's accused him of being domineering and controlling. Ringo's was more measured, but still hurt. "I don't understand why my friend is doing this." Paul read the affidavits alone in his music room at Cavendish Avenue. "They were using our shared history against me," he said. "They knew exactly what to say to cause maximum pain. And it worked." I read John's affidavit and wept, not because he was wrong, but because the intimacy we'd shared, the brotherhood, had been weaponized. The trial proceeded through early 1971. Paul did not attend. He stayed in Scotland, trying to build a new life. He formed a band with Linda, Wings, and began touring small venues under assumed names. "I needed to remember why I loved music," he said. "The Beatles had turned music into a battlefield. I wanted to make it fun again." But the legal battle haunted him. "Every time the phone rang, I thought it was bad news from the lawyers," he said. "I couldn't escape it." In March 1971, the judge ruled in Paul's favor, appointing a receiver to manage the Beatles' finances and effectively granting Paul's request for dissolution. Paul felt no victory. "I won the case and lost my friends," he said. "That's not winning." The reconciliation between Paul and the other Beatles was partial and painful. In the mid-1970s, Paul and John exchanged letters and occasional phone calls. They jammed together once in Los Angeles in 1974, but the session was awkward and incomplete. "We couldn't go back," Paul said. "Too much had been said. Too much damage had been done." When John was murdered in December 1980, Paul was doing an interview when he was informed. His immediate response, later criticized as cold, was, "It's a drag." He later explained, "I was in shock. I couldn't process it. John was dead and we'd never fixed things. We'd never really reconciled. And now we never could." The guilt and grief stayed with him for decades. "I dream about John," Paul admitted in a 2001 interview. "In the dreams, we're young again, playing in Liverpool, laughing. And then I wake up and remember he's gone and we wasted years being angry at each other." High Park Farm, Scotland, December 31st, 1970. Paul McCartney sits by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Outside, the sky's the color of wet slate. The decade is ending. The band is ending. The partnership is dissolving in a London courtroom. Linda sits next to him, silent. She knows there is nothing to say. Paul looks into the fire and thinks about a meeting 7 months earlier in an office on Savile Row when John Lennon said 8 words that destroyed his world. "I've decided to leave the Beatles. I want a divorce." The fire burns. The whiskey warms. The silence persists. In London, legal documents are filed. In Liverpool, where it all began, the streets are empty. In studios around the world, the music plays Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, songs that will outlive them all. But in this farmhouse, in this moment, Paul McCartney understands a truth he has been avoiding for months. The band was already dead. John killed it in September. Paul is just signing the death certificate. The difference is immaterial. The result is the same. The Beatles are over. The music continues. The men remain. But the dream, that adolescent fantasy of 4 lads from Liverpool conquering the world together, is gone. Paul finishes his whiskey. He does not refill the glass. He stands, kisses Linda, and walks upstairs to bed. Outside, the Scottish night is cold and dark and silent. Inside, the fire dies. The new year arrives without ceremony. The partnership known as the Beatles is dissolved. The work continues alone.